Bear with me while I figure out how to share my screen properly. But I think, okay. Can everyone see that? Sweet. Today I'm talking about counterplans. Before I like explain exactly what those are, some groundwork. There are a lot of ways to respond to a proposed idea. I've kind of just like built this one sentence that sort of models what, um, like the components of a plan, a counterplan, some of the other components of like what an argument might look like. So say that Jack and Jill are hungry and they have $10 to go buy some food. Their mom's away for the day and she tells them to go buy sandwiches. Jack says, we should get hot dogs. Those are color coded because each of the components corresponds to, a certain type of thing within debate. So in red, we have the problem. Jack and Jill are hungry. That's a problem that they need to fix. Um, and sort of like the real world model for what hunger might look like are the big impacts that you'll be introduced to a lot in debate. So climate change, nuclear war, economic collapse. Next, we have the constraints or the cost. So Jack and Jill have $10. They have no more, no less. They can spend that $10 on whatever they want, but only within that sort of constraint. And that models a lot of real world things. There are real budgetary limits that Congress and the president and whoever have to adhere to. There is limited time. So if a certain kind of proposal or a plan requires a certain amount of years, then maybe you have to work within that time frame. There's willpower, there's political capital, which is the idea that, maybe Biden does not have enough influence within Congress to get 3 or 4 policies passed, but he might be able to sway congressional politicians on 1 or 2 policies, that kind of thing. There's this resolution. So their mom has said that they should go buy sandwiches, and that models the resolution from this year that I won't read out. And then there's the plan that Jack proposes, which is we should get hot dogs. And again, like there are multiple different types of plans that might correspond to each different kind of year. Okay. So now that sort of allows us to talk about what common responses to plans are. And remember, the plan here is Jack saying we should get hot dogs. So, Jill could say a lot of things. Suppose that Jill is like Jack's opponent in the argument here. Jill could say, a hot dog's not a sandwich. That would constitute a topicality argument, which means that Jack isn't adhering to the resolution that their mom has set out. Jill could say something like hot dogs are gross. That would be a disadvantage to Jack's proposal. Jill might say that they'll leave you feeling icky and even hungrier than before. Jill could say something that resembles a critique, which is sort of a more difficult and more complicated version of an argument. But something like the proposal to eat meat is this human-centric desire that upholds animal cruelty. And then finally, that brings us to the counterplan, which is the thing that we want to focus on today. Jill could say, instead of hot dogs, let's get BLTs. They're just as yummy and they're healthy. Plus, they're $5 each. So that's within our constraint of $10. Cool. So that brings us to the components of a counterplan. And I've outlined 4. You could kind of get messy with the different components and say there are more or less or whatever. But for the purposes of this presentation, there are 4 components of the counterplan. The first component is we should get bacon, lettuce, and tomato sandwiches. You'll notice that this is like written very formally. There's like a capital letter at the beginning, a period at the end. There are no abbreviations here. That's sort of important because the text of a counterplan is really the main focus of what your proposal actually is. You want it to be very stable. You want it to be very clear, both for your judge, for your opponent, and for yourself. Because what's common is that if your proposal isn't very clear, maybe your opponent will say that BLT, if this were written BLT, is not, a commonly accepted acronym. It could mean many different kinds of things. So when you're writing the text of a counterplan, you want to be as clear as possible in outlining what exactly you want to do. Then there's solvency. Solvency is just a fancy word for, my proposal solves your problem just as well as your proposal does. So remember that Jack's proposal here is we should get hot dogs, and that's his proposal to fix the problem of hunger. Um, Jill has proposed bacon, lettuce, and tomato sandwiches, which she claims are just as yummy. So she claims it's also going to fix the problem of hunger just as well as Jack's idea to buy some hot dogs and eat them. And then there's competition, which is honestly, I think, the crux of where counterplan debating really lies. A lot of where counterplan debating can go right or go wrong, a lot of the places where you can get ideas for counterplans rests on what is known as competition. And competition is pretty related to a lot of what we'll talk about later with net benefit and opportunity cost, as well as the idea of permutations, which we'll talk about later. But basically, it's the idea that you can't really do the plan and the counter plan sort of at the same time. That's a very basic idea of what competition is. But essentially, the fact that the counter plan is an idea that is mutually exclusive or must be done separate from the plan. So Jill says, instead of hot dogs, we should buy BLTs. They're $5 each. Now, the reason that's competitive is because if you spend $10 on hot dogs, that's going to take up the entirety of your budget. If you spend, which means you have no extra money to spend on hot dogs. So they're competitive options, they're mutually exclusive options. And then the net benefit is the final component I've outlined here. Again, it's the idea of opportunity cost. And opportunity cost is, again, kind of this like fancy, complicated term that comes from economics, which is basically the idea that when you propose some policy option or you do some policy option, you're sacrificing something else. And the sacrifice in this case is your money, which you could be spending on some other option like BLTs. And the net benefit here is that they're healthy, that BLTs are healthy and hot dogs are not, which is something that makes the option of BLTs better than hot dogs. Okay, common responses to counterplans. You'll notice that each response is typically closely related to a certain component of a counterplan. So when the app responds to a counterplan, they'll either be attacking solvency or competition or the net benefit or something related. There are obviously exceptions to that, especially because this is not exactly a complete list. But that's sort of the typical scenario for that. So attacking solvency, this is what Jack would respond. And if you're trying to map this to like speech order, you would think of the plan as obviously being in the 1AC, the counterplan being in the 1NC, and then this attack on solvency being in the 2AC. So here is the 1NC. We should get BLTs. They're just as yummy. That is the counterplan. And then Jack in the 2AC would respond, yeah, but they're not as filling. I'm super hungry. And BLTs just don't do the trick. Jill in the 2NC would respond maybe with some kind of evidence in response. Jill might say, actually, one BLT is 500 calories and a hot dog is just 200. So in fact, they're even more filling than a hot dog is. And in some ways, you could treat that as another kind of net benefit. In addition to being healthier here, they're also more filling because they're 300 extra calories. And then, there may be some more back and forth on whether, calories actually make or like actually fill you up, whether either of them actually likes hot dogs or whether either of them actually likes BLTs and whether that would satisfy their hunger, that kind of thing. And that's where attacking solvency comes in. There's attacking competition. Again, this is kind of the crux of counterplan debating, I think, and also one of the more complicated kinds of debating. Even some of the best debaters don't fully understand competition because there are a lot of components to it, most of which I won't go into today, but we'll definitely explain the basics right now. So competition is basically attacked with AF permutations. And a permutation tests competition, as you can see here. And I think it'll become clear what exactly competition is and what a permutation is with some examples. Um, there are multiple kinds of permutations, multiple kinds of tests of competition. You'll see perm to both and perm to the counterplan here, but some people could say something like perm other issues or any sort of different combination of different permutations that do get a little bit complicated. Here are the two main ones though. Perm do both. So this is the idea that you could buy BLTs and hot dogs at the same time. Um, you know, Obviously Jill has said that you can't do both because if you buy the BLTs, it's going to use all of your budget, in which case you have no more money for hot dogs. But Jack might respond that there's like a deal at Burger King or McDonald's or whatever, where if you buy four BLTs or if you buy two hot dogs and two BLTs, that costs just $10. So there are a lot of ways to implement this kind of permutation. But the idea is that you can do both the plan and the counter plan at the same time while getting the benefits of both without sacrificing anything. So, BLTs are, say the healthy option, but actually you can get BLTs and hot dogs within the price. And then if you're Jill, obviously there's a pretty obvious response to this, which is like, we wanted BLTs because they're healthier. But if you buy BLTs and hot dogs at the same time, that obviates or ruins the entire point of getting BLTs, which is that you're getting the unhealthy option in addition to the healthy option, which cancels out the healthiness, if that makes sense. The AF could also say something like, perm do the counter plan. Maybe, Jill says we should get BLTs. Maybe Jack says that there are kinds of BLTs that are actually in hot dog shape. So actually the plan and the counter plan are not different options. You can actually get BLTs while getting hot dogs. Essentially, perm to the counter plan means the counter plan is the same thing as the plan, or the counter plan is an example of how the plan could actually be implemented. Okay, wait. That is a bit of a more difficult concept to understand. Could I see if are there any hands or like any questions about how that sort of mechanism operates? I can't see the full Zoom screen here, so Ravi or anyone else, if you could let me know if there are any hands, that'd be great.
Nope, you're all good.
Sweet, perfect. Okay. And then there is, a tax on the net benefit. So Jill has said that BLTs are healthier, and remember that this is the net benefit. This is the thing that makes BLTs better than hot dogs. This is a thing that makes the counter plan a better option than the plan. Jack might respond, that's actually a common misconception. New evidence actually shows that BLTs cause cancer. Um, sort of, sort of silly response, but people make silly responses in debate all the time. But this would be an attack on the net benefit, saying that the thing that you think makes the counterplan a better option is actually false, or even worse. And there's not really much more to expand on there, but that is sort of like one way that you could attack the net benefit. Now, different types of counterplans. I've listed just three here. There are a lot more different types of counterplans than that. But for the sake of simplicity, I've listed a few here, and then maybe we have a lot of time left, so maybe I can go into some of the others. So we have the advantage counterplan. This is a term that was sort of confusing for me at first, because it's not a very descriptive term. But think of it basically as a counterplan that does something else that solves the main problem of the initial proposed plan. Very vague, I know, but basically a lot of things that don't fall into the other categories, people will end up just calling advantage counterplans. And that sort of mirrors what the counterplan we've been talking about has been doing. Let's get hot dogs instead is a different option that solves the plan or the problem just as well. Now you've agent counterplans. So instead of Jack and Jill buying the hot dogs with their own money, they recruit someone else to buy them hot dogs. They say, Dad can buy us hot dogs with his credit card. That saves us money to spend on Robux or something. I don't know. Um, in this case, you have someone else with more resources than you, which saves you the entire, bit of money. And that's kind of your net benefit. Your net benefit here is saving money or saving the $10. And that's because you've recruited someone else who has this infinite store of money, call it infinite, um, that allows you to save your money for something else. And that saving your money again is a net benefit. And here there's kind of like one other response to a counterplan that we haven't talked about yet. There's this thing called theory, which is basically saying that the counterplan that you've proposed is literally like cheating. It's saying that the counterplan that you've proposed shouldn't be allowed in debate because, either it's usually because it's too overpowered or it's not an educational way to talk about policymaking, that kind of thing. So what you can say here is something like agent counterplans are illegitimate because they allow things like this, which are practically unbeatable policies that shouldn't be allowed in debate. And that's kind of the very, very watered down version of what a theory argument would look like. There are also process counterplans. You could say something, Jill could say something like, before we buy hot dogs, we should consult Jim. He always knows the best thing to do. And this is, again, what the negative would say, a mutually exclusive argument. And the reason why it's mutually exclusive is definitely a little bit complicated, but it sort of rests on this word here. It sort of rests on the word should, which the negative would say requires sort of immediate action. So let's go back to the original plan, if I can find it. So Jack says we should get hot dogs. Now, Jill might say something like, should implies that we get hot dogs right now. But if we consult Jim in the meantime, maybe that takes, a couple hours or so, in which case that would no longer qualify under your plan, which would make it mutually exclusive, basically, to go buy sandwiches. The process counterplan, again, is definitely a more complicated version of the counterplan, a definitely more complicated type of counterplan that oftentimes involves a lot of competition. Now you might be able to guess, like, this version of competition where should is an immediate action seems kind of contrived. And that's because it is. A lot of process counterplans, the way that they'll compete is sort of contrived, fake, basically. And that makes competition or permutations often the best way to respond to a process counterplan. Okay. That was most of like the fundamentals, the very simple basics of what a counterplan is. Now, obviously, there is a lot going on here. So let me know if there are any questions. Okay, looks like there was a question. How are counterplans and plans competitive with a perm do the counterplan argument? Okay, so what I understand this is asking is how does perm do the counterplan as an argument test the competition of the counterplan? And the idea here, right, is that when you're testing competition, you're asking the question, are the counterplan and the plan, at least if you're testing competition with this sort of perm do the counterplan, you're asking the question, are the plan and the counterplan distinct policy options, right? So remember that Jack has proposed getting hot dogs and Jill has proposed getting BLTs. The AF saying perm do the counterplan against this sort of counterplan would basically be asking the question, are BLTs really different from hot dogs? Could you get a hot dog that is a BLT? it's sort of a silly kind of response, and maybe there's a better example that I can give in a second. But basically, the what Jack here is asking as the affirmative, he's asking, is this really something different? Is there really an opportunity cost when you say, should we get bacon, lettuce, and tomato sandwiches? Something more common that you'll see is, say the resolution constrains you to the United States as an actor. It only says the United States. And the app proposes a policy that's like the United States federal government, so that means, like Congress and the president and whoever else, should implement green energy policies. The negative might propose a state's counterplan. So it says that instead of the federal government doing these green energy policies, we should have the states instead do green energy policies. And maybe there's an argument there to be made that the states also would just be the exact same thing, like that the United States in the original plan is not actually a different policy option from the 50 states doing um, the green energy policy. Let me know if there's any sort of clarification I could make on primitive counterplan. It is a tricky argument. Yeah. So there's a question asked, how can agent counterplans compete if they're separate actors? And you kind of hit the nail on the head there. They compete because they are separate actors. Um, so say that um, dad can buy us hot dogs with his credit card. The reason that this is a bad counterplan is exactly because they don't compete. You could have um, dad spend money with his credit card, and you could uh, buy Robux. So the idea here is like if dad buys hot dogs with his credit card, there's an option still to buy, BLTs or hot dogs with your own money. But again, that would spend your budget constraint. That would spend your $10, which leaves you no other option to spend on Robux. So remember that competition rests on the idea of opportunity cost. If dad is buying the food with a credit card, that means you, Jack and Jill, are not spending any money with your $10, which is what makes the counter plan competitive, sort of. Does that make sense? Any other questions at this point? Yeah. So we've got some questions about extending counter plans through the block. Good question. This is definitely a more technical question that would involve, actually, a good way for me to do this might just be able to pull up an example of what a counterplan file might look like. So give me 1 second and let me see if I can find a good one for that. If everyone's familiar with the concept of the block, that's obviously the 2NC and the 1NR, which is the place where a lot of the meat of your counterplan debating will come in after the 2AC has made its responses. What are you going to do after that? Okay. Um, I'm pulling up a version of basically sort of like an agent counterplan. And I won't take everyone through like the exact specifics and the mechanism of how exactly this works, but it will give you an idea of how to navigate a file and what exactly an extension of a counterplan would look like. So this counterplan is from the topic from 2 years ago, which said basically that the United States should cooperate with NATO, which is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, over emerging technology, so like AI or biotech or cybersecurity. This counterplan is an agent counterplan, which means it changes the actor of who does the actual cooperation. Instead of the United States being the one who cooperates with NATO, we have the government of Canada cooperating with NATO. And you'll notice a lot of the same kind of components as what we were talking about here. Canada's direction produces the same outcome. It's just as yummy as the BLT is just as yummy as the hot dog, or Canada's proposal or Canada's policymaking does the exact same thing as the US. But there's this net benefit here, which is that it reinvigorates overall Canadian leadership. And that's the idea that, the BLT is healthier. And if we reinvigorate Canadian leadership that does a lot of things, Canada can be sort of the power that's more effective than the US in addressing cooperation, maybe because it's more popular with a lot of our allies and adversaries, which allows us to solve nuclear confrontation, pandemics, environmental disaster, which you'll notice are a lot of the examples that I gave earlier, as what popular problems or net benefits might be. So this file is not ginormous. It's pretty large, but not ginormous. You'll see a lot of counterplan files that are a lot bigger than this. This is like sort of been all over the internet, but it's unlikely that you'll see a lot of people like sharing a lot of their files online, but this has been everywhere. So the idea is that you have kind of this main overview of what the counterplan exactly does at the top of your speech. So after you stand up in the 2NC, you've given your order, maybe the counterplan's at the top of your order, you explain very quickly what it does. So there's kind of this header, the counterplan solves all of the case, saying that, it's just as yummy or whatever, and then a brief explanation of how this counterplan exactly does it. Instead of the US bringing the plan to NATO, Canada proposes the exact same recommendation. Fuhrer says they'd be able to build consensus, which means that they'd be able to, rally all the allies within NATO to agree to the policy, especially over emerging tech, so AI, cybersecurity, biotech, which Canada is a major player in. Now, again, there are a lot of things that the AF could say. Remember that one of the kinds of responses to counterplans is attacking solvency. So maybe what the AF might say in response to this is something like, NATO doesn't listen to Canada as much as they listen to the US because the US is this heavyweight in the alliance system. The US has a lot more sway over its allies than Canada does. So if Canada, instead of the US, brings the policy to NATO, the NATO is just likely to refuse the policy outright. And then, the NEG has its own responses to this kind of deficit, and so on and so forth. So you'll notice that there are a lot of different headers in this counterplan file. When you're organizing your speech, though, you really only want to bring the relevant ones in. And a lot of this is sort of learned through muscle memory. Like obviously there's no note telling you here that this should be at the top of your speech or whatever. But typically when you organize a counterplan file, you're going to try to organize it in the way that you're going to extend it. So you'll notice that this here is very close to the top of the file, just after the 1NC is built here. And then when you move on to, say, counterplan competition, so says the AF says something like, perm, do both. The US can propose the policy and Canada can propose it as well. Then, you would copy paste this here block into your own speech document. And I won't like talk through what exactly the responses are to this because they're not particularly relevant to what you'll be debating. But what's really important here is that you're being strategic with what your responses actually are. What I'll notice at like the novice level of debating is that people might, like copy paste the entire thing, the entire file, and just read straight down. But the entire point of the way these files are built is that they're modular, they're adjustable, they're customizable. So there are a lot of responses to different kinds of arguments that the app might make or that you as a neg might be forced to make when you're giving a speech. Um, but not all of them are necessary. So what's important when you're building a counterplan file is to very clearly label what exactly you want your responses to be. This is shorthand. This AT here is shorthand for answer to. You'll see that a lot in every kind of file, not just counterplan files. So this header here is indicative that if the AF says something like NATO says no or NATO refuses, this is an answer to that kind of argument. Okay. The next question is about walking, briefly about extension through the block. There are a lot of different kinds of ways that you can extend counterplans. A lot of people, it's typically more popular to do it in the 2NC. Sometimes it happens in the 1NR. But I typically like to have it in the 2NC. It's typically just customary to do it in the 2NC, whereas the 1NR is usually where disads sort of lie. Yeah. Okay, there's also a question about negative research and how to research counterplans, how to start, how to build a file, that kind of thing. Yeah, so going back to the presentation here. What's really important when you're doing research for a counterplan, in my opinion, is competition here. Because say you have, a plan that claims to solve climate change. There are going to be a lot of negative responses to that, lots of negative alternative options to that would also solve climate change. But the biggest question is, are they competitive? So typically when I start researching for counterplans, I start by looking at competition. And a lot of that can involve looking at the different kinds of words in the resolution to ensure that a counterplan is competitive. But really, a lot of what you're going to do when you're researching counterplans and researching in general, and I'm sure this will be talked about more in the research lecture, is doing a lot of reading. Because when you think about it, right, the people behind these big think tanks and research facilities who are working on problems like intellectual property or IP or whatever, they're going to propose, say, a problem, and then they're also going to propose ways to fix that problem. And there are dozens and dozens and hundreds of ways to fix different problems, fix problems within intellectual property. The more you read, the more you'll come across people who are proposing different ideas, new ideas, innovative ideas for how to fix a problem that's been going on for decades. So reading really is one of the most important things that you can do for negative research. And a lot of times, the places where you'll find counterplan options are actually within the cards of the 1AC itself. So remember that the 1AC is the first speech of the debate. It's where the affirmative will propose their policy, propose their plan, and they'll read, maybe like 10, 15, 20 cards to support their policy. The place where I find a lot of counterplans that are different options, mutually exclusive options, competitive options to the 1AC's plan is actually by looking through the cards of the 1AC itself. Because often the way that 1ACs are constructed is the exact same way that we've constructed this sentence here. 1ACs will identify a problem, they'll identify constraints, they'll identify a plan in the end, right? But oftentimes what you'll find is that their cards about the problem and their cards about constraints are not related at all to the plan that they end up proposing, right? So say that they've identified a problem of economic collapse and maybe they have a plan to solve economic collapse, which is, maybe pump more money into the economy or fix tax loopholes or whatever. But the initial problem that they've identified, that economic collapse is an issue, it's here now and it's bad, is not always something that will be tied to the final evidence of the plan. So when you're looking at a 1AC and it says something like economic collapse is coming, that's going to be really bad because, it will destroy the leadership of the United States and it will make a bunch of people's lives worse. The people who are saying that, the researchers or policymakers or whoever is saying that will often have, sort of proposals to solve that problem that might be distinct from what the plan actually is. And that's, just one sort of way to do the kind of reading, the sort of close reading that's essential for building a counter case to a 1AC. And it sort of goes the same for constraints or cost, when the 1AC has identified the problem and maybe its plan is something like say, I don't know, again, like injecting more money into the economy. The cards about that might be discussing sort of this ability for the federal government to actually put more money into the economy. Um, Maybe it's their, I don't know, say their solvency card, which is like injecting $1 trillion into the economy would fix, current economic problems, and it's within our ability to do that based on how much money the federal government has at any given moment, right? So that would be an argument saying that the plan rests within the constraints of, the current policy problem. You'll see a lot of times in those cards that there are, like counter arguments to that sort of thing. And maybe those counter arguments will cite particular scholars who are saying that no, the USFG, the federal government does not actually have $1 trillion to spend on this kind of thing. And those scholars might be saying instead of spending $1 trillion, we should do this other kind of thing, this other counter proposal, counter plan alternative to spending $1 trillion on the economy. Um, a lot of other times, doing negative research will, you know, sort of rely on like what people have done in the past. So what you'll notice as you go throughout the year is that at camp there will be very basic versions of counterplans, that will be modified throughout the year, right? So there will be different variations of counterplans. Um, and a lot of times it's because when someone proposes something, say, spending money on the economy or, fixing tax loopholes, there's a basic version of that idea. And then there's the more complicated version of that idea with, you know, different kinds of modifications made to the policy proposal. So, when you see a counterplan at camp, don't assume that is the final form of a counterplan. Or when you see a counterplan at the beginning of the year in September or October, don't assume that's the final form of the counterplan. Don't just get comfortable with, the state of how that counterplan is, how it works, how it solves. And maybe once the AF has figured out its best responses, don't assume that the counterplan is completely dead in the water. Because oftentimes policymakers will have a lot of ways to sort of iterate on a very basic idea and make it much better in response to different kinds of attacks on that. Okay. Now, a quick introduction to what conditionality is was also a question asked in the chat. Okay, so think about it like this, right? Say Jack has proposed we get hot dogs, right? And Jill initially proposes that we should get BLTs. But say in this new world, Jill's like, we should get BLTs, or we can get burgers, or we could get chicken sandwiches, or we could go to like a different kind of place and get, I don't know, like some Korean barbecue sandwiches or whatever. And attached to all of these things are different net benefits. So, burgers are cheaper, which means we can spend money on other things. There's your kind of net benefit. You have burgers, which are cheaper. You have BLTs, which are healthier. You have, I don't know, maybe you go to one of your local businesses that sells different sandwiches, and that supports local businesses. And for some reason, that's also a kind of net benefit. And you can kind of see how Jack in this scenario is getting a little overwhelmed. Jack is like, "Holy crap, you're throwing all these different ideas at me, and there's too many to juggle, and some of them are contradictory. And like I don't have enough time to respond to them all." That is a very, very basic and sort of complicated way, or a very simple and basic way of explaining the idea of conditionality, which is at its simplest the idea that the negative side must be constrained to a limited number or a limited certain amount of counterplans that it can propose. But for a lot of the reasons that Jack was stating, in that, maybe a lot of the positions are contradictory, or there's not a good way for Jack to respond to all those different arguments at once. Maybe it's not, realistic for the negative to be able to have, 10 different ideas with 10 different net benefits, and that sort of thing, for Jack to respond to. So really quickly, let me see if I can just bring up what a normal conditionality debate would look like in a document here. So this is, say, in the TUIT. So the one in C has proposed 10 different counterplans with 10 different net benefits that are really hard to respond to in an 8-minute speech. Okay. The 2AC says conditionality, which is the argument that we were talking about earlier. Conditionality is a reason to reject the team. Shifts neg strats to emphasize, say, coverage over clash. Destroys neg advocacy skills. And these are sort of complicated terms that I'll break down in a second. And emphasize coverage of clash. I don't know. And ruins in-depth education or something like that. Prefer, for the sake of this conversation, let's say unconditional options. So remember that when the negative has proposed 10 different counterplans, and say that the 2AC does try to respond to them all, and maybe the 2AC responds to 9 of them really, really effectively, like absolutely destroys them, but because of the different constraints, has one counterplan that they haven't sufficiently responded to. Of course, if you're the neg in the 2NC, you're going to extend the counterplan. You're going to continue to propose the counterplan that the 2AC didn't respond to. And in some ways that feels intuitively a little bit unfair, right? Like, how can you expect the affirmative, to completely cover all these different kinds of positions with the same kind of efficacy with sort of equal kinds of efficacy, right? And that seems like a legitimate response. It's hard to be app. It's hard to respond to 10 different kinds of positions. So conditionality would say that the neg is not able to kick different kinds of counterplans as it chooses, to get rid of different counterplans as it so chooses, because that does all these things. So let's just talk about these really quickly. This is sort of an argument that the neg instead of focusing on its best policy option, will just choose the counter plan that the AF hasn't sufficiently responded to. And the AF would say that's a bad model of debating because instead of, the neg being realistic and sort of choosing an option that is really effective in the real world, it just turns debate into this game of like whack-a-mole, where if the AF does not sufficiently whack the counter plan that has been proposed, then that's the one the neg is going to extend. Um, Also destroys neg advocacy skills. The idea that if the negative were only allowed to propose, say, one counterplan per round, they would get really, really, really good at defending that option. They would do a lot of the in-depth research for that kind of option. They would, be able to know the ins and the outs and the pros and the cons of a certain counterplan and adjust and modify that counterplan throughout the year or throughout the round um, in order to make it a better option. But instead, if you have 10 different counterplans with 10 different net benefits, and then the negative just is not going to go as in depth into that argument as they might be able to if they were constrained to just one counterplan. Um, I guess a sort of important thing is what this looks like in 1 and C cross-X. So oftentimes after you read a 1 and C that has different kinds of net benefits, the affirmative will ask you a question. So this is the AF question of whoever's giving the 1 and C. What is the status of the counterplan or counterplans? It feels like a sort of like nebulous, like no one has actually like really any idea what this means when they start debate. But basically what they're asking is like, is the counterplan or are the counterplans conditional? And in basically every scenario, the neg response would be something like the counterplans are conditional, or the status quo is always a logical policy option. For the sake of this lecture, treat these as basically synonymous. They mean sort of the same thing. This essentially means that at any point, the negative should be able to kick all of the counterplans because the status quo, which is the current state of the world, should be an effective way to combat the proposal of the 1AC. Basically, it means that you should always be able to weigh the disad versus the case, or the disad in the status quo without a counterplan against the case. A little bit convoluted, but again, just treat them as conditional. So when you respond in this way, the counterplans are conditional. That means you will be able to kick your counterplans later. You will be able to get rid of certain different proposals that you've already made in order to focus on one or laser in on one later. So then the 2AC is like, that's unfair. You shouldn't be able to kick your counterplans. And the 2NC has a lot of different kinds of ways of responding. I'm going to really quickly paste the block that I usually read in here. This, you will notice, is sort of specific to a topic, and that's always kind of the way that you want to build blocks in general, is that you want to make them topic specific. But let me sort of just explain what each of these arguments is. You're also free to take this exact block or not exact block because, there are some topic specific things, but if you'd like, as a response to conditionality, you're free to take this, and I can send this to whomever. Give me like 15 seconds to grab my laptop charger because I'm low on battery. Be right back. All right, we're back. Um, because I see another question, and because we're, I think, running a little low on time, I'll only explain kind of the main proponents or components of what the neg's response to conditionality would look like. So you'll see here that the top level response is something called flex. You'll also see this called something like neg flex or neg ground or something like that. And the main argument here is that unless the negative is able or allowed to kick its counterplans, that makes the topic sort of unfair, right? So maybe the neg is really not in a good position with its ground. Maybe there aren't very good disadvantages to the 1AC. Maybe AFs are sort of being tricky and they're kind of hiding a lot of their position until later, in which case the neg needs to be able to adapt and read a lot of different alternatives to the plan in order to best see kind of like what the best um, point of attack might be against a specific 1AC. So this is the neg flex argument, saying the negative should be allowed should be allowed to be flexible to read different options to actually ensure that debates are fair. If the negative, say, is only able to propose one policy option that it has no option to kick or change or whatever, then maybe that makes um, the the battlefield kind of skewed toward the affirmative. And really, in my opinion, this is always or almost always going to be one of the best responses against conditionality. That unless unless the negative is able to read multiple different kinds of counterplans, multiple different options, then the AF will often be able to win too many debates. Okay, that's like a very, very simple explanation of conditionality. Um, I will respond to this next question now. How do you respond to a counterplan when the neg claims fiat? Okay, so if I'm understanding this right, okay, I think I see. So the idea of a counterplan it is basically the neg's own kind of fiat. So let me go back to the lecture. And maybe it's good to sort of get an understanding of what fiat is first. So fiat is this term that comes from Latin that means let it be done. But in debate, basically it means that you are imagining some sort of policy option that is placed into the world. You can kind of think by magic. So when when Jack says we should get hot dogs, um, you're sort of imagining that, you know, um, that they're able to get past a lot of the constraints. So like maybe the neg is like Jack and Jill don't have a car to get hot dogs. Fiat would sort of say like, we're kind of implanting into existence, we're bringing into existence the idea that they are able to get hot dogs. Um, Even if, maybe in the real world they don't have a car, or maybe in the real world, there are some constraints on where you can get hot dogs. Maybe like, you know, maybe like hot dogs are kind of scarce, that sort of thing. But when Jack says we should get hot dogs, it implants into the world this imagined world where they can get hot dogs. It fiats that world into existence, sort of like a magic wand. So when you're imagining that, counterplans themselves have sort of the same kind of fiat that the AF's plan has. Let's get BLTs. Maybe BLTs aren't readily available, or maybe they don't have a car to get BLTs, that kind of thing. The neg gets access to fiat in much the same way that the affirmative gets access to fiat. So um, again, the question is, how do you respond to a counterplan when the neg claims um, fiat? It's sort of a question of like, is the kind of fiat they've claimed unfair? So we can go back to like this agent counterplan, right? Neg fiat typically in and of itself is not unfair. You'll see AF teams that say the negative should not get fiat, but that's not really an argument that's taken very seriously. What you can say, though, is something like agent counterplan fiat is not legitimate. And that's kind of the theory argument that we've gone through already. Being able to change the agent is unfair because it allows you to do things like this, like a dad buying hot dogs with his credit card. So, there are different types and certain types of negative fiat that might be considered unfair. And you can make those kinds of arguments when you're AF, but typically the neg using fiat in and of itself is not something that's unfair because practically every counterplan will use some sort of fiat because fiat is just, the idea that this thing happens, that Jack and Jill do get BLTs. So I mean maybe the more popular way of explaining fiat um is sort of like encapsulated in this phrase should, not would. So, if the policy proposal is like the United States Congress should implement a green energy policy, um, a response to that kind of policy wouldn't be, oh, but Congress hates green energy policies. So that would never happen. What fiat does is that it blows past, it kind of evades a lot of those constraints about whether Congress would do a thing, and instead asks the question of whether Congress should do the thing. Um, and again, that's sort of the same thing here. Like the question is not whether Jack and Jill actually would get BLTs or would get hot dogs if they were given the option, but should they get BLTs or should they get hot dogs if they have this constraint of mom um, telling them to go buy sandwiches, that sort of thing. Does that answer the question of how you respond to a counterplan when the neg claims fiat? Thumbs up, thumbs down would be awesome. Okay, cool. Are you sure? Because I know like the concept of fiat is a little bit complicated. And if there are any follow-up questions, I'd be happy to try explaining further. But if not, cool. Okay, sweet.